Hello, everyone. My name's Anna. I'm from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and it's my great pleasure to be introducing the ASAP speaker for this week. So it is my great pleasure to be introducing Dr. Siddharth Pandey from Amity University in India. And I'll give you a short bio shortly, but I'm super excited to be introducing Sid because he's one of the original bridges in this Asia Pacific region. He started off his space career by doing a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering in Amity University in India. He then went on and did a master's degree in space systems engineering in the Netherlands and his PhD in aerospace engineering from UNSW in Canberra in Australia. So already at the start of his career, he was building bridges all around the world. And while he was in Australia, he was heavily involved in the Mars Society of Australia and also the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. So very, very international experience already, working really hard to build this great community. Since then, he's had lots of experience in the US at NASA, working at NASA Ames, doing some Mars and Venus surface missions. He's always been very engaged in education and public outreach. If you look him up on YouTube, you'll see several great YouTube presentations, including a TEDx talk. So definitely look out for that. And I think it's great because I think he really believes in social consciousness and including everyone, which is part of one of the missions of ASAP as well. So very honored to have him speak today. Right now, Sid is the head of the Center of Excellence in Astrobiology at Amity University in India. And as the head, he has been leading initiatives to establish India's first dedicated center for astrobiology and space biology research. And he, again, is bringing all the knowledge from all of his previous years of work around the world and incorporating it into his current endeavors now. And without further ado, I'll let him take over and show you what's been going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was such a wonderful introduction. A very, very warm greetings to everyone all around in different parts listening in. So this is going to be a challenging talk for me, but at the same time, very exciting. Challenging because it's an overview talk, and those are always full of areas where you're not comfortable with. So I'm going to do my best navigating, presenting some of the areas that we have established. And also probably having some fun, taking you on a ride around some of the exciting astrobiology sites here in India, some of them which we have started exploring and some of which are still waiting to be explored from an astrobiology perspective. So I think I will start with this group photograph that was taken on an expedition 4 years back. And the reason I start with this slide is because in many ways, this is where astrobiology in India kind of started forming itself into a united effort. This was an expedition to Ladakh up in the Himalayas. I'll be talking about that site later on. But every member that you see in that image has played a very pivotal role in getting astrobiology research, giving it that visibility on the international end. And some of the members here, Martin, he wasn't there, but Martin's student, Luke, was with us. And Dr. Jonathan Clark, who I think should be joining the meeting soon or has probably joined, he was also a mentor for me. And I was in Australia at that point of time, finishing up my PhD. And that expedition actually was one of the main reasons why I decided to move back to India and establish a new center. And it also tells the importance of astrobiology as an area which really requires, and it's not a luxury, but it's a necessity to have that interdisciplinary as well as an international collaborative, effort for it. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground today, so please bear with me. I will try to ensure that I'm on time. So I'm going to be moving fast through some of the topics, but trying to do a little bit of justice to everything. Well, I will start with presenting the working groups in India, the astrobiology main working groups in India. And I put a little bit of a disclaimer there that we don't claim ourselves to be a comprehensive coverage of astrobiology. There are still pockets of people who we're trying to reach out to and involve, who are doing a lot of relevant work to astrobiology. and talk about the different analog as well as the lab work that we're doing. And lastly, talk about some of the workshop and outreach activities that we did recently. So I think I don't need to go into my introduction. I think Anna did a fantastic job doing that. But I think the main message here is that I'm an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I'm an engineer who got trained in aerospace engineering and then picked up experience working in Mars and space bioscience teams, developing hardware. And that skill set is something which is not very easily found amongst astrobiology groups. So I find myself useful to several endeavors. One of them is developing sample acquisition systems. Right now we're developing something for the lunar missions, but a lot of that is very critical for even Mars, collecting subsurface samples. And off late, recently, we have been involved in developing hardware for microgravity experiments in low Earth orbit. So I was at NASA Ames developing some hardware for studying how fruit flies would be behaving in microgravity. So these are the kind of skill sets that I have picked up on a personal level, from a research level. And along with that, I have been involved in coordinating astrobiology expeditions and being part of brainstorming meetings to strategize the expeditions and the roadmaps and workshops. So these are some of the things that I bring to the table and have kickstarted this new center, like I mentioned. One endeavor that we have had at the national level is to have a body that would represent all astrobiologists. And we are working towards registering ourselves as a society here in India. And we've had 2 meetings in the last year where we met and we kind of did an ice breaking as well as brainstorming and came up with a white report that was submitted to our space agency, which kind of lays down some of the roadblocks, the challenges, the short-term and the far-term goals for astrobiology researchers in India. And once this is live, we will be sharing it with everyone online. It's called the Society of Astrobiology Education and Research, SABR. So that society will have members from all around India to have a common representation. And until then, we're all kind of representing astrobiology in our own institution level capacities. So one slide on the working groups. I will not go into full details because these are elaborate talks in themselves, but we basically have divided ourselves into 4 areas. We've got the origins and sustenance of life. So a lot of the prebiotic chemistry work, which Dr. Sudha Rajamani has been undertaking. And I think she's working closely with many members who are part of ASAP. So hopefully we'll get her on soon and she'll be able to give a talk on the work that she's been involved in. And she's mainly been looking at how lipids and fatty acids are behaving in extreme environments, hot acidic environments. And that's at least one part of the work that she did when she was with us in Ladakh. We have Dr. Mukund Sharma. He's a Precambrian paleobiologist. So they study some of the oldest rocks that we find here in India and the fossilized organisms in them. And in Ladakh, when we had gone for our expedition, they were looking at the metabolism of some of these organisms that live in very hot spring environments, which are analogs to early Mars hot springs. And he was studying the glucose uptake of these organisms and comparing them and seeing how different it is in different temperature points. We have a habitability and biosignatures group, which is right now the biggest group in terms of just the number of people, with Dr. Benita Farthial. She's a geomorphologist, and she looks at paleoclimates, ancient climates, and habitability in cold desert environments, and pretty much the upper Himalayas, the Ladakh regions. Dr. Sudha Rajamani again. I have a small stake in that group as well. We are currently exploring a crater region here in India, and I have a slide on that, so I'll talk a bit about that and seeing what parallels we can draw in the Earth basaltic craters and some of the Martian craters, and seeing the ability of different features inside these craters to preserve, signs of past life. Mention for Dr. Yogesh Sauche. He's a senior microbiologist here in India who has been involved in collecting and isolating microbial organisms from stratospheric altitudes. So they've had balloon flight experiments for the last almost 10 years now. And I think they have plans. They've been working closely with the Indian Space Agency, and they have plans to do more such flights and try to characterize and see what, try to ascertain whether the origin of those microbes is terrestrial or extraterrestrial. So they have been working on that. I think the panspermia side of things. And Dr. Snehanshu Saha at BITS Goa. So he's a computer scientist. He works closely with astronomers. They are coming up with several machine learning algorithms for trying to characterize the habitability potential or the habitability scores for exoplanets. So that's one exciting side of astrobiology, which pertains to exoplanets, and there's work going on in that area. And of late, yes, we have been developing hardware for conducting plant growth experiments in low Earth orbit as well. So I think one thing is to say about the working groups is that these are groups of people who have been working in their own capacities for at least a couple of decades, at the most. But in general, from an astrobiology perspective, things are very new. The line of research has been established by each of these individual groups in the last few years, 4 years, 5 years. So it's relatively a new environment for India to kind of venture into, and we are working closely with ISRO to identify what kind of experiments we'd like to conduct in space. So a quick, what I'd like to do is kind of walk through the different analog sites that we have in India. So it's almost like an atlas that we are preparing here in India. And while I say this, it actually strikes me that it might even be useful to have Asia Pacific atlas of astrobiology sites that we can actually put together that actually cover all the sites, because most of the papers that I've read, they tend to document the sites in the Americas or Europe. And I think that's pretty much because most of the work has taken place in those regions, so they have been heavily published and documented. So our efforts are hopefully that we can bring visibility to some of these sites in India and the Asia Pacific region. So Ladakh, like I mentioned, is a high altitude, dry desert environment. And what's unique about Ladakh is that you have a lot of diverse terrestrial analog sites within a very limited area. So that's exciting because it allows you to do different kinds of samplings, different kinds of experiments. So you have these high altitude glacial sediments, and you have these little meltwater pools that form right below these glacial sediments, where you can find these organisms that live at, when I say high, we're talking about 5,500, 5,600 meters above sea level. So very, very high altitudes, high UV exposures, and very minimal rainfall. So you have organisms that survive in such environments. We also have sand dunes, so within the valleys, so similar to the kinds we find on Mars. And even inside these sand dunes, you have these ephemeral ponds that form seasonally. And inside those ponds, you find clays, you find all kinds of exciting organics that we are actually looking for on Mars as well. Hot spring sites. So this is exciting, and especially for Martin's group and Mukund's group here in India, who are studying the terrestrial origins of life, trying to understand some of these very extreme environments and in which these hot springs are situated. And there's one hot spring site in Ladakh, which is exciting because it's boron rich, and that's a key element that has been identified to have a say in the origins of life. And Martin's online, thankfully. So if there's questions on that, I hope he takes it. So that's another exciting aspect of Ladakh, these hot spring sites. And of course, there are these really, really salty hypersaline lake environments, which are analogous to the lakes that could have existed on Mars at one point of time. And around these lakes, these are obviously receding lakes. We're actually seeing the effects of the changing climate as well every year. In fact, when I was there last year, it was almost 3 years since I'd been on our expedition in 2016. And we could see how the lake is in fact receded even further because of higher rates of evaporation. And right around these lakes, you have these raised shorelines, which are similar to the ones that we find on Mars as well. And lastly, of course, there's permafrost that we can find in Ladakh, which is again very exciting for people who are trying to study how life can be preserved in ice traps inside the surface on Mars, perhaps. Moving on, there's another site in central India, the crater site that I mentioned. So basalt craters are rare in India. There's only 3 other sites in the world that are basalt impact craters. Lunar crater in central India happens to be one of those. And this crater actually has a delta on one of its walls. And we have drawn parallels with Jezero crater on Mars, which is where the 2020 Mars rover will be landing. So we've had about 3 visits to Lunar crater so far. It's a crater that has been studied quite well from microbial ecology point of view, and also from a point of view of studying how craters form. So just meteoritic impact studies. But we are going in there from an astrobiology perspective and trying to study the gullies, the delta region, and the ejecta, and trying to find how organics are preserved in these basaltic cracks and slopes, and then trying to see if we can use drones or the drone-based sensors to be able to characterize some of these sites. So our goal is to see how well we can use this terrestrial analog site to build instruments that would one day be flown to Mars for conducting astrobiology studies. Another site in the west of India is actually a great salt flat called Kutch. It's one of the biggest salt flats in the world. And just with most salt flats around the world, we have these seasonal ponds that form. And the one that you see in there having that algal bloom, the red algal bloom, we have all of these little ponds that appear seasonally, which can also be studied. And it's also been studied by another group in India for the formation of jarosite minerals, which is another mineral that has been found on Mars. So that, and then in the Antarctic region, which India actually has 2 stations in Antarctica, and one of them is in the Larsman Hills region. So we have also identified the Larsman Hill region as a potential site for conducting astrobiology studies. A large portion of it is ice-free. It receives a lot of heat from the underground. And you have these glacial ponds and subglacial lakes. And all of these are also very exciting, obviously, for any Mars or an icy moon astrobiologist who would like to study these environments, which have been well preserved, are very, very cold, dry, and yeah, it's all of these different components that really bring out the essence of a strong astrobiology site. We also have limestone caves, lava caves in India, and a lot of those are spread across the country. The image that you see here is from Meghalaya, which is a state in the northeast of India, and some of the longest limestone caves in the world can actually be found here. And obviously a lot of organisms, microorganisms, and also larger fauna have been found there. In fact, very recently they found a blind fish, and there's always every second year you have these unusual species that get discovered in such places. And just trying to understand how life grows under the ground is obviously very exciting, because on Mars we are looking at how life could have perhaps saved itself from all the extreme environments by remaining under the surface for long durations of time. We also have an active volcano system on an island of the eastern Indian coast in the Bay of Bengal. And there have been a few studies where people have tried to isolate bacteria that grows on the slopes of the volcano, but nothing else. And it's a very restricted area, so we need a lot of permissions to get there. And thankfully, we work well with some of our government institutions, which are in a position to get those clearances and be able to have us work there. And lastly, in the Southwest Indian ridge, we have, in the Southern Indian Ocean, we have this field of hydrothermal vents, which were discovered a few years back. And they're unusually, I think, large. The vent field is quite large in a place where it would not have been expected to be that large. And it's another site, obviously, for doing more and more research and understanding how life grows under the water and how it evolves and remains in these surfaces. So this is just a table to kind of summarize all of these different sites that we have in India. And hopefully within the next 10 years or so, we've at least started some level of work in these different sites and published some of our work, and being able to get these sites onto the astrobiology atlas, so that it's areas that have been identified. And another thing to say is that contamination is another issue with most of these sites. at several levels. So it's important for us as astrobiologists to really identify and cordon off areas to ensure that there's work. All right, so with that out of the way, with a heavy overview of astrobiology in India, I will now focus on the work that's happening at my center. So we are a very, very young center. We've just been in existence for over a year now. And being a new center, we are hosted at the Amity University, Mumbai. And thankfully for us, we have been given this opportunity to just really kickstart some work, which is the primary focus is astrobiology for us. So we're not just doing astrobiology on the side, it's really the focus of our center. And building on the work that we've been doing in Ladakh and Lunar, one of the strong focus areas is to conduct exploration and site potential of these places from an early Mars analog point of view. Of late, we were selected for a spaceflight experiment. So that actually kickstarted another focus area where we are developing small experiments that would be flown to low Earth orbit. And that's primarily space biology driven. So traditionally, it doesn't really come under astrobiology, but because we're such a small group here, we are definitely undertaking that kind of work. Of late, we've also kickstarted some work in just understanding how do you develop systems for off-Earth drilling. So just the extreme environment in which a drill has to operate in the low temperatures. So planetary drilling technology development is another important area. And we have recently been made a nodal organization for ISRO, which is our Indian Space Agency's outreach network. So ISRO regularly conducts a lot of workshops, and they have a network of nodal organizations all across India. And as part of that nodal organization network, we're able to register students from across India to participate in the workshops that ISRO conducts. So recently there was a planetary geoscience workshop, for example, and we actually mentored about 20 students under that. And we also undertake a lot of public outreach. We've had 3 events so far, and we've had good response from people. We've made it important to make outreach an important, you can say, vertical of our center. So we're not just focusing on research by itself, but we want to ensure that we are talking to people outside our domain, as well as just the general public and involving students. And I think that's the essence of astrobiology, that it's not a closed group of people. It's an open group of people and kind of works and builds on that. And we have been lucky and fortunate to have forged partnerships with some of these institutions in the different areas for technology, astrobiology, Mars research, and also science and communication. So this is a growing team. We've had almost 9 to 10 students so far. They've been undertaking research, summer internships, and our faculty is from the biotechnology school here at Amity. We also have 3 adjunct faculty members from overseas. So they've been instrumental in really shaping up this new center. And because it's a new center, we strategize it in a way that we don't take on too many people to start with. But yes, there will be opportunities opening up soon. We've recently had one announcement of opportunity for a full-time position that closed a few weeks back. But as and when we have more positions to open up, I will be sharing those with you. So a little bit about the microgravity research. So within India, we have 2 opportunities for conducting biological experiments in space. The one on the left that you see is a PS4 platform. So that's basically the last stage of the PSLV rocket. So once the main satellite has been put into orbit, the 4th stage or the last stage is actually used as a platform, and it's kept active in orbit for about 6 months to a year. And that gives an opportunity to conduct a microgravity experiment in low Earth orbit. So this opportunity was granted to us. We got selected for this, and as part of that, we built this piece of hardware, which is not a very big piece of hardware, and that's actually what made it quite challenging. It's roughly the size of your old school VHS tapes, so it's not very big. It's pretty narrow, and that's because the hardware had already been selected, and we'd just been given that slot to fly an experiment. So as part of that, we decided to put ourselves into this project and then built a plant growth observation experiment. And this experiment really focuses on understanding how plant calyces grow in microgravity environment. It's a slow incubation growth. It's got a long incubation and a slow growth. So it actually allows us to see how each of the features develop over time. And we built this in about 4 months. So all in all, it was a very exciting project, and building a spaceflight experiment and the essence of the time really comes with it. It really is a great learning experience and a team building experience as well for us. So we were able to do this and put something together. And there are more opportunities like this that will be coming forward as well. So, and I think the reason I'm presenting this slide is to just inform everybody that there will be opportunities for joint collaboration where we can actually fly experiments together to microgravity environments. So feel free to reach out for that. We were partnering with Paras Defense and Space. So that was our industry collaboration, and they supported us with all the components that we would be needing for this flight. And another thing to mention, sorry, is on the right side, you see the Gaganyaan capsule, which is our Indian human spaceflight capsule, which will be flown on its first test flight early 2021. And as part of that, we're actually submitting a proposal to fly more experiments. The advantage here is it's inside the capsule, so we don't have to worry about the temperature, pressure, radiation, because it's actually human rated. And the other big advantage is that you get your samples back, whereas in the first PS4 platform, you don't. So an experiment could be something as simple as just having it exposed, and you don't have to do all the experiments on board. Whereas in the case of the PS4, a lot of the experiments and data analysis was actually done on board. So these are the two kind of opportunities that we have, and we are in the process of our biotechnology school actually has supported us for this. Just before COVID happened, we were in the process of setting up our space biology lab as well that would support the flight experiments. But so as to say that I think this is an exciting opportunity that we have here in India, and I'm very happy to share it with the ASAP community and others who would like to be a part of this. So now coming to our early Mars analogs. So I'll talk a bit about our first expedition in 2016 and some of the findings to just kind of give an idea of the kind of work that's already kind of taken place so far. So like I mentioned, in 2016, we had our first expedition. It was part of the NASA Spaceward Bound program. That program has taken place all around the world in different kind of sites, mainly in the US, but also Australia, New Zealand, and Namibia. And we had our first Indian expedition in 2016, and that was to Ladakh, the place that I mentioned. So Ladakh is a high altitude cold region in the north part of India. And like I mentioned, it has all of these different diverse extreme environments. And that's really what makes it unique and different from a lot of the other similar extreme environments, perhaps in South America. The fact that you have all of these different kinds of regions within, you can say, 50-kilometer radius. So for a team that wants to sample from different kinds of sites, it's really significant. And we were obviously at very high altitudes, so ranging from 3,000 meters above sea level to almost 5,500 meters above sea level. And there were several transit studies where people were collecting samples and seeing how the altitude was actually kind of playing a role in the biodiversity over the region. Because with the altitude came the variation in oxygen, UV radiation, all of those kind of things, atmospheric pressure. So with a Spaceward Bound, how it normally happens is you collect samples and then you bring them back to your lab for analysis. You also conduct certain in situ measurements, which helps you monitor the macro environments. So basically the temperature, humidity, and pH levels, and in some places also the UV radiation levels. And how this helps us is it helps us in several ways. It helps us just refine what are we really looking for on other planets. What should be our protocol for defining if what we have found is biotic or abiotic. So that's, I think, a very hot area where people are trying to refine the biosignature definition protocols. So it allows us to do that because you're exposed to so many different environments, and it helps you test your protocols. testing technology. So you can actually carry any handheld or compact instruments that you have developed and test them in these sites and see how rugged and robust they are to be able to withstand some of the elements. So for example, I'll talk about one instrument that we had from the European Space Agency's ExoMars team, and they actually tested that instrument there as well. And you can obviously do a comparative analysis. And last but not the least, it's a great learning exercise for students, for teachers, as well as for researchers, because as an astrobiologist, no one is an expert. Everyone is learning from each other. So just being in the field really, has really worked for us. This chart kind of gives a progress report of the different sites that we visited from in Ladakh. So the glacial high passes, the sand dunes, hot springs, saline lakes, and the different activities that we conducted at each site. So Dr. Jonathan Clark, he was heading the regolith landform mapping, where we basically take images of different sites and we kind of try to characterize the different features within an image. We break those down and then we label them according to what we are seeing there. And this is a landforming technique, landform mapping technique that would really help us kind of ground truth some of the aerial imagery that we take, or the satellite imagery that we take from the orbit. So when astronauts will be on the surface of Mars, these kind of techniques will really help us characterize the surface topologies and the mineral concentrations and the different features that we see. So that exercise was conducted there. Comparative planetology, where we were looking at different features and comparing them. So the instrument, like I mentioned, was the HABIT instrument, which basically tries to see how different kinds of salts undergo deliquescence in the presence of Mars-like atmospheric pressures, early Mars or present Mars atmospheric pressures and humidity. We also did several life detection analytical protocols, so ATP and LPS measurements, trying to see how varied they were at the different sites, and biomass and microbial diversity, metabolism kind of studies. So a lot of the work, as you can see, is still dots, which means there's future work. And we will be going back next year, hopefully, fingers crossed, if everything improves. I won't go into much detail with each of these sites, but basically these are the different things we did. We basically documented the environment properties, the outcrops, and to mention that our paper is already out. So those interested, I'd be happy to share the overview journal paper that came out from this particular expedition. And they were obviously science-specific papers as well that came out from the different groups who were part of that expedition. Here you see two geologists taking core samples, looking at the high altitude glacial sediments. And a lot of these glaciers are actually now, not active anymore. And that's just the sign of the impact of climate change that we're seeing. Yep, so that's the regolith landform mapping, which John had conducted. And as you can see, they were categorizing each of those different features that were kind of distinguished by these bold black lines. And each of those sites were given a description, a definition based on the kind of materials and also what exactly those features were. So this is a prototype of the HABIT instrument that was tested. So HABIT stands for habitability, brines, irradiance, and temperature. So this instrument was built by the team led by Dr. Javier in Spain, UK, Spain, and Sweden, as he's all over the place with his work. But it was an excellent expedition for them because they were able to field test and just monitor the local environment. So they were measuring wind speeds, relative humidity, ultraviolet radiation, and they had carried different samples of salts. And they were using electrical conductivity to see how the physical state of those salts was changing over time. And it would kind of enable them to understand how do these salts behave in Mars-like conditions. So they were able to confirm the deliquescent melting of calcium chloride in one of the sites. And there's more details in the paper on the work that they've done. And they've tested it in a few other terrestrial analog sites as well. So dune ponds, obviously very exciting for people trying to understand how to clays, for example, preserve organics. So the clays that we found in the dune ponds in Hunder actually showed us how they had the highest concentrations of life, of microbial life, as compared to many of the other sites. And there were also studies where people were trying to understand the wind directions and comparing wind charts over different seasons and seeing what are the seasonal effects of the flow of winds over time. So that has an important role to, for us to understand how do different topological features form. So basically that interplay between wind directions, wind speeds, and the formation of different geological features on Mars, and trying to understand that by looking at how are these different regions forming in Ladakh. So yes, so hot springs, like I mentioned, hot springs at high altitudes boil at lower temperatures because of the low atmospheric pressures. And it's just this very unique geochemistry that exists at these sites, which is interesting for us to understand. And hot springs are obviously important because they're actually bringing up the subsurface fluids and elements out. So one doesn't really need to dig or drill down to find them. And that's why these sites on Mars are now so exciting, and the places where we are actually finding these byproducts of these geochemical activity, and trying to understand whether these byproducts are having any biological role, or are they just geochemically driven. And that's really what's exciting about studying hot spring sites. And like I mentioned, boron concentration has been confirmed at Puka Springs, one of the hot spring sites that we visited. And there's several lines of research that can be done. A lot of it has already been started by our group. And I think from my perspective, trying to understand how do you sample a hot spring field, because hot springs are not just one site that you go to and you pick up. It's normally a large field, at least tens of kilometers, wide and long. And how do you approach these kind of hot spring sites? How would a rover do that if there are no humans there? And what kind of strategy should you be following to ensure that you're not contaminating the sites, but at the same time being able to sample the different sites? So those are all very interesting things that became very apparent when we were in these analog sites, because we reached these places that were large. Some of the sites were actually contaminated. So how do you find sites where you're getting this positive outflow of water and ensuring that the samples that you're collecting have not been, affected by any other external influence from the outside? So these are just some of the experiments, and Dr. Sudha Rajamani, in fact, has published the work that came out from the work from the samples that they collected, where they were trying to study the vesicle forming ability of these fatty acids in these high temperature environments. And I think the key message was that there were these really strong and robust mechanisms at play that were allowing them, and they've remained in those environments for so long to have evolved to do that. We were also seeing, like I mentioned, the metabolism activity and how glucose was being consumed by these microorganisms. And they actually had a higher uptake of these of glucose as compared to the organisms found at lower temperature and pressure. So they had really adapted to those temperatures and were actually flourishing, not just surviving in those environments. The last site, like I mentioned, were these saline lakes. So they're obviously very similar to sites on Mars. So for people who are studying salt-loving environments, so hypersaline environments, trying to understand how do these environments play a role in supporting hypersaline organisms. And here we see some of those different images. So salt crusts right up to the shore of the lake. And another image of a rock glacier. So again, the place was just full of things that we can find from Mars, and they were just so well preserved because there's very little weathering activity that takes place at these sites. So Lonar, like I mentioned, we've had 3 visits already. It's closer to our university campus. It's about, well, closer in the sense as compared to Ladakh. Ladakh is about 2.5-hour flight away from Mumbai, whereas Lonar is roughly about 400 kilometers. So it's about a 6-hour train ride or a 1-hour flight away from us. But it's within our state, so it's easier for us to go there and do work and come back, say, within a few days. So it's an important focus area for us, especially because of the 2020 rover, the NASA rover that is launching. And one one important aspect we have done is identified 3 different terrain environments that we'd like to study. So basically starting off with the delta fan, looking at the organic deposition in the sediments and taking cores from there. And also obviously doing drone-based observations from a height. The second terrain is the inner crater gullies and seeing how do they drain into the basin and how do they have these cracks and slopes for preserving some of the organisms. And lastly, the outer ejecta blanket, and trying to understand what role they might be playing. That's a table at the end to show the different similarities and differences between Lunar and Zero crater on Mars, where the NASA Mars 2020 rover is going. It's obviously a much larger crater in size, and the age is obviously also very different. But in terms of the different features and some of the mission goals of this crater, I think there are strong links that can be drawn between the two. So finally, we have had some workshops on our campus. So our first Amity Astrobiology workshop was held in the last week of February. And this was an introductory workshop for science and engineering students. So we had members from all across India, from 9 different cities. So we had about 30 students. We capped it to about 30 so that it's easier and more intimate for us to kind of talk to everyone. And it was a very hands-on workshop. It wasn't just lectures. We were looking at different kinds of rock samples that can be found on Mars. People were learning how to inspect them using hand lenses, also drawing. So using drawing as an exercise to kind of learn and understand the different features of a rock that might not just be apparent if you're looking at an image. So really that hand-eye coordination and working slowly and steadily and understanding the different features that came out of it. And we had a lot of quizzes as well, where we divided the team into several groups and gave them different images of just different parts of pretty much anywhere in the solar system, and they had to guess whether it was from Earth or Mars. So we had a lot of fun with those. We also gave them some controversial images of organisms or features, and they had to figure out whether what they were looking at was a living object or it was a non-living object. And there was a lot of debate in those discussions. And the point here to drive home was that we still don't have a complete grasp over identifying whether something is living or non-living. That still is something that can be contested. And that's just the hypothesis-driven nature of astrobiology. That's the way things move forward and how groups of scientists from different schools of thought kind of work against each other. But always towards a common goal. The second workshop that we conducted was called Space for Everyone. So this was a workshop that was actually open to people outside the space domain. So space enthusiasts, people who were interested in space were kind of brought in. And this was our public outreach workshop. We got a discussion with a NASA astronaut. One exciting thing that we did was we developed this game, which was actually very interesting. It was a Mars surface VR rendering that we developed in collaboration with this company in India called Theodon Technologies. And it wasn't just a game for fun, it was actually a learning exercise where inside this game, we actually placed certain features. So if you're looking at my slide right now, you will see that the person who is inside this VR, so you put on those the headset, and then you have your hand remotes to go. We'll actually place these features, such as these blue marbles, like you find those hematite pebbles on Mars. And we had also placed ice deposition. So the goal here for the student was within a fixed duration of time, he had to find these different regions and flag them. And we had a small team that was sitting on the outside who had been given a 2-dimensional map of the entire region, and they were simulating mission ops. So they were actually guiding the astronaut on the surface of Mars in different directions. And there were these mud volcanoes that were placed. There were these cracks in the ground that were placed. So, and then at the end of the 7 minutes, there was this, as you can see on the horizon, you have this dust storm, a Martian dust storm, which was coming in. And it obviously wouldn't kill anyone like it did in the Martian movie. But what it did, it would just obscure your visibility. So this is the ice deposition. And then, so it was a very time-driven game that everybody really enjoyed. But they also learned the importance of communication when you're on a different planet. You know, how does that play a role? How do you simulate that on the surface? And the learning really. So we asked them questions like, you know, which feature in your view would be the most important for someone who's trying to find life on Mars, and why? So they had been kind of briefed on that during the workshop, and then this was their practical exercise where they were doing this. So we see, you know, these kind of different ways in which we can really involve people. It's a lot more than textbooks. And maybe right now in this COVID environment where you really can't take people into the field, you know, tools like these will really come in handy if you can develop them for different environments to kind of teach people, you know, from their own laptops or desktops. You can actually go around in a first-person point of view and visualize these kind of environments. So I thought that was interesting to present and tell people that this is a capability we are developing here. And it's not just for outreach. This can actually be built to test, you know, how would you explore terrestrial analog environments? How do you train for that? How do you train students to do that? So we can play around with it and develop different kinds of things with that. So that's it. That's my last slide. I'm actually, I think, just 12 minutes away from ending. So apologies for talking for so long. But because this was our first talk from India, I thought it would be fair to give an overview of everything that's happening. Please do visit our astrobiology website and subscribe to it. We try to send out regular updates, and we're also now part of the ASAP network. And next week, we have, hang on. We have Dr. Anna Wang and Dr. Albert Fahrenbach from the Australian Centre of Astrobiology will be talking to us and giving us an introduction of their center, as well as introduce us to some of the work they are involved in. So please do register for that, and we really look forward to hearing from them. So with that, I will now take questions.
Yay, so I'll clap. Thanks so much, Sid, for taking us through a really wide range of things. And it's pretty cool seeing a space scientist and engineer speaking like a geologist too.
Oh, no. I will not pretend to be one for one moment.
No, it's very, very impressive. And I think it makes us all want to travel to India, but
oh yeah,
in the near future.
Hopefully next year. Yes.
Yeah, hopefully next year.
Yeah.
So I forgot to mention earlier to encourage people to type questions into the chat. So now we have some time for Q&A. Please do feel free to type questions into the chat and I will pass them on to Sid to answer. And for now, I'll ask the questions that are already there. So working backwards, on slide 24, if you could...
oh, sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah, so Andre had a question about slide 24.
Was it this one?
Yeah, it's this one about all the activities that have happened at all these different sites. So the question was, what are the plans on microbial diversity and metabolism work regarding both future work regarding future work? Like what is planned to study microbial diversity and metabolism? Is it going to be cultivation-based, molecular type work, or both?
So that's a great question, Andre. So one of the main challenges we have faced with Ladakh is just getting samples back to the lab, preserving them in whatever environments they've been found, and bringing them back. So that's in a way kind of limited us in the work that we can do. We are in the process of exploring setting up a small laboratory space in Leh, the closest township that actually allows us to do this. The reason why I'm saying that is because it takes days before we can get the samples back. So we do plan to go back, and first things first, we will do our, in the field in situ measurements and the work that we can already do while we're there. But down the line, for sure, that's an area which we haven't actually spoken about, that I would be very happy if you're keen to have that discussion with us as to how we can go ahead with that. Another trouble we've faced in the past is getting biological samples out of India. And I'm sure you might be familiar with all kinds of biosecurity laws that kind of prevent people to take samples outside. But having said that, there is a process in place to do that. We do have a process under which we need to basically declare that these samples will not be used for any commercial purposes. It's only for research and collaborations. But that's a 6 months to 8 month long application process that we need to kind of work towards. So I think to answer your question, we don't have a molecular biology person right now who's kind of working on this. So if you or anybody else who's interested and would like to work on this, we'd be happy to talk more on those lines. What we had plans to do was to continue on with some of the ATP, LPS based or any field-based studies that we can do to take things forward.
Okay, fantastic answer. Yeah, so another follow-up question from Andre, actually. Given that, mapping and engaging with such a diverse community seems to be quite challenging, what are some strategies for making sure that, you find out about as many different people as possible and try to get awareness of researchers that you haven't collaborated with before?
Mm-hmm.
It seems very challenging logistically.
Oh, so when you meant mapping, does he mean?
Just in general, like trying to sort of discover and map, as in, I guess he means create a map of researchers, like all the different people that do this.
Well, one way, and this is just one way, is coming out with an overview of astrobiology potential of different sites. We did that with Ladakh, and it was not easy because a lot of the research is kind of scrambled all over and it takes time. So what we are doing is we're doing it site by site. But I think down the line, what would be nice is having one joint publication, which kind of, and do it for each region and kind of, which brings out some of these sites, and that could all come out in the form of a digest, in a particular journal that kind of covers astrobiology sites in different regions. So for example, the Indian subcontinent, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, and then just kind of tackling a few select science questions, and then just kind of using those science questions to elaborate on the environment. Within the scientific and student community, I think if something comes out in a peer-reviewed document that actually, obviously, as you would know, holds a lot of weight when it comes to people trying to understand what can be done. And I'm actually open to suggestions on how we can do this as well.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. I mean, I guess it's a challenge.
Would you mind if I just add something there and clarify my question? I think that those are great ideas and great thoughts. And thanks for the interesting webinar today. My question had more to do with your move towards creating an astrobiology community in India and the networking efforts that you've done. Like, how complicated has it been? Because India is so big, there's so many different institutions. How challenging has it been? And do you fear that you might be missing out on institutions and researchers that you have no idea that are doing research that is relevant for this?
So that's a great question. It took us a long time. Just like anywhere else in the world, we have scientists working in silos here in India. Not to any critique of them. It's just the nature of how academia has been for a long period of time. Thankfully, for a few of us, handful of us who were keen on collaborating with each other, we got together 4 years back. And I think some of the main challenges has just been getting people to a workshop or a place to just talk to each other. It's been very difficult to do this over the internet. And I think just the communication part has been the challenge. But as soon as there's a task in front of everyone, I think to answer your question, the challenge has been finding a united or a common objective for everyone to work towards. Because there wasn't one, and all of these different sites were interesting to people in their own capacities, no one really found it as an incentive to kind of come together and do anything. And I think one way we kind of brought people together was we did this this vision document, astrobiology vision document that ISRO had actually, the Indian Space Agency had actually asked of us. And that kind of became a task that everybody could contribute to, and everybody wanted to have their science and their say in it. And then we realized that, yes, everybody was willing to come forward by themselves. So that's been the main challenge. The other challenge actually has been finding early career researchers who are interested in astrobiology and find a way to remain. We don't have a postdoctoral culture in India. We normally just go from master's or PhD into scientist level positions. And that postdoctoral culture, I think, is very important. It's only there in a few labs in India, but not everywhere. So, and most of the people who are interested in astrobiology in India are senior researchers who have got so many things going on. So it's those two main things, the common goal, as well as the early career researchers who really have the time and energy and a bit of experience to kind of put things together has been the hard bit. But things are, getting somewhere now, and it's really nice to have groups like ASAP form, because that allows us to kind of connect with people. If you don't have an expertise in an area, then we can connect with people outside our regions as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. We have a volunteer from the audience, Ram Ganesh, who said that he's interested in collaborating, I believe, on cultivatable and NGS analysis for microbes, as well as for some life detection analysis. So I encourage you two to get in touch.
Thank you.
After the seminar
Please do write to me. Yep.
Fantastic. So we have lots of questions popping up actually. So from Marta, we have a question on microbial studies. Is the plan to focus on prokaryotes, or will you also look at eukaryotes, for example, fungi?
So there are no plans in place from the microbial research point of view. So if there is interest in that region, we'll definitely open up to that. It's just fundamentally been applying scientific techniques, what has been done in other sites, and then bringing them here. But yeah, no one's looked at funguses or even lichens for that matter. So we'd be happy to have people work in that area.
Nice. And the next question is from Henry, who makes the organism even more complicated. And he asks, for the microgravity low orbit mission, what was the plant that was sent up?
That was a tobacco callus that we were using. It's a high yield crop, and it's an organism that has been well studied by our biotechnology group. So it was a kind of a model that we were using, but we can fly any kind of callus.
Okay.
I think the name was Tobacco nicotiana. That's the name of that callus.
Cool. Next question is on dust storms from Kaustub. So can dust storms on Mars have any measurable effects on the microbial life? Also, are there sites in India that can allow people to study the effect of dust storms?
So we actually saw a dust storm in Ladakh, and it actually happened very close to one of the the saline lake environments. And one of the participating expeditioners used that as an inspiration to understand how dust storms or winds can actually lift microbes up to high altitudes. But that's about it. We didn't really explore that further from that. As far as Mars goes, as I understand, microbial life, if it were to exist, it would probably be under the surface. And also, yeah, we would really need to calculate the lift capability of the dust storms on Mars, because the Martian atmosphere is not dense enough. It's actually quite rare. So whether the dust storms are dense and strong enough to kind of lift up organisms, but yeah, I think that's just as far as my understanding of them go. But yes, for sure, both in the salt plains in Kutch, as well as some of the valleys, the high altitude valleys of Ladakh, we did see formation of dust storms.
Fantastic. And yeah, Jonathan Clark also has added a couple of comments in response to that. So yeah, seems like a very important problem. Cool. So next question. So from Henry, this is actually the first question that was asked a while back. So can you talk a little bit about the organizational side of things, how the members in the center work together, how the relationship works with the university, and like whether the university helps fund the center a bit, or whether you have to look after that yourselves?
So Amity University has me and all the other full-time researchers on a payroll. So we're all paid by the university. And for the adjunct faculty members who we have, Amity covers one travel per year. So they pay for living and travel expenses for 10 days. And that the reason that they're doing that is because these members have been instrumental in working for almost 5 years now in India and helping establish that. So they've recognized that and they're doing that. In terms of collaborations, how it works is we normally collaborate for expeditions with local institutions or government institutions who have experience working in these regions. That's what we did back in 2016. And the funding of most of these expeditions comes out of individual participant expenses. We did receive sponsorship. We have received sponsorship in the past from several companies. One of them is Tata Motors, which is an Indian automobile company that actually sponsored the expedition. We have received funds from Australia-India Council, for example, for some of the work. So the university, what it does is it puts in a small amount of funds, but they expect us to write grants and win proposals just like pretty much any other university. But the researchers who work at Amity University full-time are paid by Amity.
Okay, thank you. And just branching off from that, a question from Shrishma. So firstly, thanks for the presentation and for showing us the amazing expedition sites. So the question was, what are the goals of the center? And then more broadly, what are the major goals of India in astrobiology in general?
So yeah, so fantastic question that we are chewing away for the last 6 months to kind of elaborate on. So first, I think with India, so the roadmap that we have presented to ISRO has short-term and long-term goals for each of the working groups. So all of the working groups have identified, scientific goals for themselves, including, our center. We've identified if you're working on a problem, how extensively do we want to study it, and work on those. From a more high-level point of view, I think what we are really interested in happening within India is to firstly have a regular event happening each year. So we are working towards having a national conference of astrobiology in India. I think that's one goal that we hope to have started soon, because it's only when we meet every year is when we'll be able to have a stronger connection with each other. And what tends to happen right now is even though on paper, yes, we might be a society, but everyone's working in their own individual capacities. So that's one important goal. The other is documenting and just kind of creating a catalog of terrestrial analog sites in India. And this table that I had presented is kind of, in a way, a part of that, where we're trying to identify what are these different sites, how are they relevant from an astrobiology perspective, what are they analogous to, and how are they important from a mission standpoint. Now that India is having, it's had a first successful Mars orbiter mission, and they're planning to have more lunar missions and Mars surface missions. There will be regular opportunities for astrobiologists to propose instruments that they can send. And we want to be in a position where we can build instruments. We want to be in a position where we are confident about our analog sites, we've identified them, and we use them regularly to help build the science around them. So I think these are some of the higher level goals. So enhancing communication, working closely with ISRO on missions, and as well as developing a student community, an astrobiology student community, who can then become early career researchers and kind of help formulate some of those things. And at my center, like I mentioned, our goal is to have an elaborate space biology lab that can support experiments in microgravity, as well as undertake some of the work that's happening in Ladakh and Lunar. I think these are some of the main areas that we are focusing on here at our center.
Yeah, really, really thoughtful answer. And we have one more question along these lines, which is if we zoom out even more and people internationally want to engage with collaborations with India, like how does the funding work? How has it worked with your experience of collaboration so far, and how should new people go about doing it?
Absolutely. So if I answer the question in terms of field expeditions, whenever we have had an expedition in India, like I said, the organizers have sought funds from several companies like Tata Motors, who gave us a huge chunk of money that brought down the participation costs and some of the travel costs for the organizers who came from outside of India. So that's, and I think it's a collective effort to raise funds for expeditions. A lot of the times, the people who are coming into India write grants to their institutions or their countries. We can also tackle bilateral funds. So, for example, India, Australia, India, New Zealand, all these countries have got different arrangements in the US. Those are the ones we've explored. And for other people from other countries, we can also explore similar agreements, which normally fund a lot of science and technology and also education and outreach. So I think these are some ways in which we can identify funding for expeditions as well as for development. As far as the flight experiments go, so ISRO does not charge us for the launch. So once we get selected, we are expected to bear costs for the development of the hardware and supporting the human resources. But because we are an academic university, and if we get selected, we get a free ride. But at the same time, there are all these other expenses with regards to building the satellite or the hardware.
Still a really good opportunity though. So I think on that note, I might just encourage anyone who still has time to stick around and please continue discussions. This talk, I believe a recording will be made available, and so please feel free to share with your local communities and your colleagues from around the world. That would be fantastic. So thank you, Sid, once again for that fantastic presentation. And I guess we can officially conclude here, but everyone else please stick around and chat.